Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third installment of our Coping with COVID-19 webcast series. I'm Peter Stanton, the publisher of the Worcester Business Journal, and this morning our guest is Congressman Jim McGovern. We're going to be talking about the imminent proposal in front of Congress to supplement another round of funding for the CARES Act and how that's going to help small businesses and nonprofits in our region. This webcast series is made possible by the support of our presenting sponsors, and they are Webster 5 and Fallon Health, both leading organizations who have stepped up not only bring you the Coping with COVID-19 series, but have been good corporate citizens contributing their support to the Central Mass community in many ways during this time of crisis. We are also joined by a couple of Jim's colleagues, Hirsch Eschmark and John Nadzowski, and they're also with us to help answer some of your questions. I've tried to integrate most of the questions that came in before this session began into our conversation, but we'll try and get to some of the others at the end. And the Congressman staff, I think, will also be following up with some folks who had if we don't get to your question. So, Jim, what's it been like in the last month?
Well, I think it's been strange for everybody, but for those of us in politics, we're used to meeting with people one-on-one, speaking to groups, doing town halls in person, coffees with your congressman, whatever, and so. We can't do that anymore. So we've been doing a lot of this, which is just, it seems a little bit unnatural in a lot of respects, but I'm getting used to it. If I cut you off, it's because I'm not as comfortable with the technology as I should be. But it's, it's a difficult time. And, even personally, I mean, my dad passed away in November, and on Easter, we couldn't spend Easter Sunday with my mother. She left me a to-go package at her front door. But I mean, it just, we want this over with, and I think we just have to make sure we listen to the doctors and the medical experts and do what they tell us, and so that we don't prematurely try to relax the restrictions and end up, starting all over again.
Yeah. Got it. So you're now in D.C. right now.
Correct. Yep.
How many other House colleagues are also in D.C. and you've got a big vote? I think it's scheduled for tomorrow.
Right.
On this next piece of legislation.
Yeah. I mean, I would expect. My committee, the Rules Committee, will meet tonight at 5 o'clock, and I think there are. A couple of members who have told me they're not going to make it, but I expect a close to, well, more than I expect most members will come back tomorrow. I think we won't know until we have the vote, but we're going to have a roll call vote on this next package, and my guess is that most people will want to be recorded on that. Now, some people can't come back for a variety of reasons. They have members of their family who are ill, or they're from states that have very strict stay-at-home orders, and we have some members who have significant and very serious pre-existing conditions, and they're concerned about not only their health, but they're also concerned about interacting with other people and whether or not they may be spreading the virus.
Yeah. So the bill that the Senate just passed yesterday is close to $500 billion.
Correct.
That would mean that in the last month, Congress will have passed, if this one goes through on Thursday, about $2.8 trillion, 3.5 times the total bailout money for the Great Recession. Mm-hmm. How do you put that in context?
Well, we've never experienced anything like we're going through in our lifetimes. I mean, literally every aspect of our society has been impacted by the coronavirus. I mean, by the shutdown. Our economy is literally, shut down, and we need to get through this, time, this emergency time, and try to figure out through social distancing and through listening to what the medical experts tell us, how, we need to figure out how we get to a point where we can safely start to slowly but surely bring businesses back. Some businesses will be easier than others, but this has had a tremendous impact on everybody. I mean, so when you say put it in context, I mean, we've never had anything like this happen to us before. But I do know this, and that is that to get back to an economy that is vital and that is vibrant means that we have to take this social distancing stuff very seriously. We have to listen to the doctors and medical experts. We're going to have to provide emergency funds to businesses and individuals to be able to just sustain themselves through this period of self distancing. And then we're going to have to start thinking out of the box about what other things do we need to do to help lift our economy up as quickly as possible. And so, we're dealing with the emergency now, but we need to start thinking about recovery and what that looks like and what we need to do to help make that possible.
Right, and I think we'll touch on that. A couple of the questions were about that. We'll touch on that sort of near the end. I guess the first kind of line of questioning, I think that where we've seen just a ton written and a lot of concern among the business community is that PPP funding. First round, $349 billion, basically used up or allocated within the first 2 weeks. The cupboard has been empty, and now this passage is hopefully imminent on Thursday. Do you know, has anything different? Have there been tweaks or changes to those PPP guidelines in this second round?
No, they haven't. They haven't been. I wish there were. I mean, because not all businesses are the same. I've heard a lot from the restaurant industry, in particular the hospitality industry. They need some additional flexibility. But the honest truth is that the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said making any tweaks at this particular point is a non-starter. We're going to have to eventually make some tweaks. There'll be another package that we're working on. Probably won't deal with that for another 2 or 3 weeks, but there are going to have to be some adjustments. So this is just basically a straight extension on the PPP. More money. I think it's $310 billion in funds for PPP has been put into that. My hope is that it will help a number of businesses who were basically shut out of the first round.
Mm-hmm. We had a conversation. We're going to have a session with Bob Nelson from the SBA director from Massachusetts and Chris Watson from Webster 5 on Monday. I think it's going to land on Monday, sort of talking about how folks can make sure they access this second round. But I know one of the concerns is that it's been the smaller people who've been shut out. And
Right.
in the news, it's been some of the larger chains that sort of somehow backdoored their way into, even though they have more than 500 employees, they somehow, met arguably loose qualifications. So that's the kind of tightening up you were talking about.
Right. Well, but in this bill, one of the things we've done is we fought to create a set aside for insured depository institutions, for credit unions, and for CDFIs. So some of this money is going to be a little bit more focused on mission-based lenders who know their customers, like family, and can meet their specific needs. And so there's some money that's a little bit set aside for that, for those kind of lenders, and I hope that will help. But look, I mean, I think a lot of us are frustrated when you pick up the newspaper and you see that Shake Shack, gets this big, loan, and yet, some of the smaller mom and pop businesses in Massachusetts and across the country are told that there's no money. I'm glad that Shake Shack's given the money back. There's a few others that need to do the same, I think. But look, I mean, those that need it the most are those, local small businesses, not the big gigantic chains. And, and we need to make sure that we don't forget them and that they're taken care of in here. And my hope is that, that the second package, although the guidelines overall haven't been changed, some money has been set aside for those smaller lenders, those mission-based lenders.
Mm-hmm. So those would be people who probably weren't maybe SBA lenders before, right. Or, one of the things Bob mentioned was trying to get all the the documents translated into several other languages, right? So that smaller businesses from minority communities could have more access to.
Well, and what we learned in the first round was that some of the, financial institutions, credit unions, some of the community banks, that didn't have a long history of SBA lending. It took a little while longer to get them into the mix so they could actually provide loans to the people that they service. And again, one of the, I mean, I'm not sure you could ask this question, but one of the questions that we're getting a lot now is that, from businesses, look at, I filled out my application, I have everything in, I was told there's no more money. Now you're going to approve more money. Do I have to start all over again? And the answer is no. I mean, so we're, I just wanted to be clear about that because we're getting an awful lot of calls on that.
Yeah, and I think I've talked to several folks who've gotten funding or not quite, and I think if you had that SBA approval number,
right,
you were going to get the money. And once a business is approved, the bank has up to 10 business days to disperse those funds. So I think there are still folks who didn't get that money yet out of the first 349.
Right.
And I think your other point is, if you're in line, just stay in line with your institution.
Right.
But for those without a relationship, it sounds like a lot of the friendly place has been a lot of smaller community banks for those without maybe just a checking account relationship.
Right.
So you mentioned some of those smaller institutions, and I think the SBA has been signing up additional, some of them web-based, digital, financial firms into that SBA program to try to get that processing going. One line that I think Bob or the SBA gave is they processed in 14 days, basically 14 years worth of volume that the SBA otherwise would have done.
Oh, it's look, it's a monumental task that they have to undertake. I mean, it's like drinking water from a fire hose. And I know some people are frustrated that, all their calls have been returned quickly, all that kind of stuff from the SBA. But I mean, they were not prepared for this, and it just happened. And now they're staffing up and they're trying to meet the needs. But again, I mean, I would urge people who are on the call. You mentioned two of my staff people, John, who's in my district office, my district director, and Hirsch, who's down in Washington, does my policy stuff. I mean, if people have questions, I mean, give us a call. I mean, we're working remotely at our homes, but give us a call and we can sometimes, get the answers to your immediate questions. And also, on my webpage, McGovern.house.gov, we're constantly posting the latest updates. And when this legislation is passed in the House on tomorrow, we will have an update on all the details and some of the things that might make it easier for some businesses to apply. So
just to kind of break into that package just a little bit further. So the biggest piece in that $489 billion is the PPP program, right?
Yeah.
There's also what's called the EIDL, which is Economic Injury Disaster Loans.
Mm-hmm.
And those are sort of a little easier. Some of them are supposedly $10,000 within 3 days when you apply. Right. How have those gone? And do you know if there's efforts to make sort of that piece of the legislation? Those aren't necessarily, the $10,000 could be forgivable, but there's also a loan program. I think that's $60 billion of this piece. We're all checking our notes here. But any direction or instruction for folks in terms of that EIDL program, or is it really PPP that's been 90% of the questions?
The PPP has been what people have been, have called the most about, and who have had, had some challenges with. Some people have not, some people have, but that's been the focus of most of the concern to our office.
Mm-hmm. So Jim, so it's about $300 billion into the PPP, practically doubling.
And I should also say, in this package, there's also some money for hospitals and
correct,
and also for testing too, because I think we as we talk about how we're going to get this economy back on track. I mean, we need to have a better control of this virus, and I continue to believe, that testing is everything. I mean, you know, without knowing who is infected and who can spread it, I don't know how you can control it overall. We need to do a better job on that, and there's some money for that in there too.
Yeah. So is there any sense of how long this second injection of funds on the PPP side might last? Are there projections being made?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard everything from a week to 2 weeks, maybe, which is not long. And again, the need is great. And so Congress is going to have to do more. Now, whether it is adding more money to the PPP in the future, or whether we need to be thinking of other ways to help be able to prepare businesses to at some point reopen, you know, we're going to have to. That's what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks, trying to figure that out.
So some of that I know, and I've heard from restaurants and restaurant associations, is sort of maybe a delay in the application of those funds, right? Because if you're paying your employees during the 6 out of the 8 weeks, if you're closed, it doesn't help a lot when you're trying to sort of have that money for what's going to be a soft opening, right? To those.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, when restaurants are able to reopen, it's not going to be, oh, you know, we're, you know, make your reservations because we're going to be packed. I mean, they're going to be guidelines, and some people are going to be nervous about going back out to eat in public, and you know, when it's appropriate. And some people might be nervous about, you know, going to a hotel, or, you know, some of the, you know, hospitality functions that exist out there. So it's good. We need to be sensitive to that, and so I think in the next package there's going to have to be some language that understands the uniqueness of some of our businesses.
Yeah, it's breathtaking. We're at 2.8 trillion and counting, and we're talking about the next package. You know, so let's if we sort of step into what we've read in the presses about the negotiations on this bill. There was a push to get the PPP funds done immediately in the last week. I know largely the Democratic caucus has negotiated to have some testing and some hospital funding as part of this particular round. And obviously hospitals and healthcare are big industries here.
And also some set-asides, you know, to mission lenders to help some of those businesses. Yes. Right. So that's also, yeah.
So which sort of helps spread out and make that PPP money more fairly distributed. But hospitals specifically, I think a lot of us have seen interviews with Eric Dixon, and, you know, all these hospitals, their most profitable surgeries and procedures have been put on hold. And so I know this is a second round of funding for hospitals. Do you know, how is that directly going to help? How is that being applied sort of when we get down into Massachusetts hospitals and UMass and St. V's and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, they are going to get some direct funding, which I hopefully they already have. But it's also we're still trying to deal with the current crisis. So more money for, you know, not just testing, but for PPE, not to be confused with PPP. You know, that you know, to try to help get them through this. We're also trying to fight in the next package for more money for state and local governments. You know, some of the money the city of Worcester received, for example, the city manager has been able to use to help some small businesses that, again, you know, fit into a unique category that might not be able to apply for some of this other stuff available, but is able to help them get through this crisis. Also been able to help deal with the, you know, providing for some accommodations for those who are homeless in our city. So it's important that, you know, again, I mean, we need to continue to make sure that the hospitals have what they need to deal with the crisis. The issue of hospital financial stability is going to be an ongoing discussion well beyond this package, because it is huge. And you mentioned the fact that a lot of the profitable kind of elective surgeries are kind of put on hold right now. It's unclear when that will be lifted. I mean, the governor is going to play a role in that, obviously, but he wants to do it.
I think you could go get your surgery in Georgia right now.
Yeah. Well, you know, you go, which is, look at, and which is problematic, right? I mean, you know, when we talk about a state by state response, and, you know, when there's no kind of national coordination, that is dangerous. I mean, and it relates directly to our businesses. I mean, our states are not separated by invisible walls. I mean, people travel back and forth all the time, and we have, interstate commerce. I mean, on and on and on. I mean, this disease is unforgiving. It is, if you listen to the doctors, it's like nothing that we have seen before. And so, I would urge the president, to stop retweeting things like liberate Minnesota, liberate Georgia, liberate. I mean, instead he should be tweeting, listen to the medical experts, because this economy cannot recover. Our businesses are not going to be back on their feet if this gets out of control again. Speaking
of medical experts, I think many folks in Worcester obviously are aware that the one Dr. Anthony Fauci is, of course, a Holy Cross grad, and that's a quality here in the city, which is a nice connection.
Yeah, he is a Holy Cross grad, and so.
So, question: we talked about hospital funding. I noticed a specific amount of money was also mentioned for community health centers, which were already running on, pretty thin margins, to say the least, right? Is the healthcare funding covering just hospitals, or how far down into that sort of a healthcare support system does the CARES Act and maybe this round cover?
Yeah, the CARES Act provides some funding for community health centers, although not nearly enough. And again, that is, that is something that we're going to have to address in more detail in the next package. I mean, originally, what the Senate was insisting on is simply an extension of PPP, nothing else. And we have added to that. But it is by no means, this is an interim package. This is not addressing all of our community's needs. I mean, there's no money for state and local governments in here. There's a need for it, right? There's no money to help people on SNAP, which used to be known as the food stamp program. We're seeing a high rate of food insecurity and hunger throughout the country. Our food pantries and our food banks are at capacity. We need to do something. There's nothing in here for that. So there's a lot of stuff that should be, that I wish were in this package that is not. But the stuff in this package, I don't really have a problem with. It's going to help people in our community. But there's just so much more that needs to be done. Yeah,
it is inspiring. You mentioned, food shortages and other emergencies. The Worcester Fund, that collaborative effort of the United Way and the Greater Worcester Community Foundation, has just been, done some amazing work, and then just spending that money almost as fast as it's coming in to help plug some of those holes that you're talking about.
Right, but the reality is, even before this crisis, our charities and our foundations, are not a substitute for a commitment by the federal government and by state governments to deal with issues of poverty and food insecurity. I mean, we need a more aggressive response. And before all this happened, I expressed frustration over the fact that government too often, and even in good times, it treats people who are struggling in poverty as an afterthought. I worry in times of crisis that these people are going to be considered invisible. And by the way, that in turn adds to the healthcare crisis. We have a humanitarian crisis on top of that. And I visited a food pantry in Leominster when I was there last week. And I mean, the number of new clients is unbelievable. And that's just in Leominster, but it's all over the state, all over the country.
So, question I wanted to talk about, obviously we're talking a lot about the PPP, and I have a little more to say about that. And we talked a little bit about sort of healthcare being such an important industry here in our region and an important support structure, for people's health. Another big industry in our region is higher ed. And higher ed, no one has gone unaffected by this crisis. And clearly, in March, I think every campus shut down for the remainder of the year. There has been some funding. In fact, I think the president's comments about Harvard brought this up. But Specifically, Worcester Business Journal ran an article about some of the funding that has gone through, very much related to need-related grants of the student body, right? And I think so far, QCC has received out of the CARES related funding 4.8 million, Worcester State 4.2, and other schools, upwards of $1 million, maybe as low as 600,000 or 700,000 for all those Central Mass colleges. Is there a sense, does that industry need, what does the higher ed community need? What do students need as supports? Obviously, there's some money already in the bill.
Yeah, no, and look, I mean, the money that's in the bill, I think, is helpful, and our delegation has been on numerous Zoom calls and conference calls with our, presidents of community colleges, our state colleges and universities, our private colleges and universities. I had a long chat with Father Burrows at Holy Cross, it was yesterday, and talking about some of the challenges and the uncertainty of not knowing whether they can fully reopen in September. And try to figure out the pathway to move through here. I mean, a lot of the money that has been distributed has been based on a measure of Pell Grants and student need. And we're going to have to continue to focus on that. But there's going to have to be some additional thought. I talked with Chancellor Collins at UMass Medical School a couple of days ago, and he explained, the developing impacts that the COVID crisis had on graduate student and postdoc fellowships and traineeships and research assistantships. And, our country and higher education system depend on university research to continue to make breakthroughs and discoveries. I mean, even in terms of trying to find a cure to this current crisis. I mean, that may happen at UMass. But we need to make sure that we're supporting, NIH and NSF funds that go directly to support, like UMass Medical School, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and again, I hate to use the word bailout because it sounds that the implications don't sound good, but there needs to be some sort of recognition that. Our institutions of higher education literally cannot, get by without some sort of additional relief. And, and what we don't want to have happen is we get through this and we get to the point where things can open up and go back to normal, where we're saying, okay, well, the way we're going to deal with this is we're going to pass the cost on to the students. Because at a lot of these, especially the community colleges and some of the state colleges, I mean, one of the things that makes them attractive is not only they're great schools, but they're affordable. Yeah. I also worry about our private institutions as well, some of which were having a tough time even before this crisis hit. And, I worry that some of them won't make it. But our colleges and universities in Massachusetts are kind of our natural resource, if you will. I mean, they are economic engines. And I look in the city of Worcester, and so much, of the development that we see has been in collaboration with these colleges and universities at every level. And so much of some of the great things that are going on in our public schools is because of that collaboration. So, we are talking to the presidents and to the chancellors and to all of our institutions of higher learning, trying to figure out what would be most helpful and what can we get consensus on. Because I will say this, I mean, I have lots of ideas on things that we should be able to do, but I mean, I have to not only pass it in the House, it has to pass Mitch McConnell's test, which I regret, but that's just a reality. And then it has to pass Donald Trump, his test. And we all have to agree, otherwise it doesn't happen.
Gotcha. Hey, so we talked about higher ed and hospitals, and I want to talk a little bit as we go about sort of some of that, how you see the future and funding and how things are going to go. Are there any other industries in particular that you think are particularly vulnerable? We've talked about restaurants, but that really includes we really should put hotels and the hospitality sector kind of into that same, under that same umbrella.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody is adversely impacted. I mean, there's no, some are harder hit than others based on the nature of the way they do business. But we need to understand that everybody's been impacted by this. This is unexpected, and quite frankly, our country should have been better prepared. We talk about our hospitals. You talk about the great work that Dr. Dixon and Cheryl Jackson doing it at the same. I mean, the day before the DCU field hospital opened up, they had about enough PPE for a day, like a couple of days. That was about it. And then at the last minute, they got it. I mean, what's happening now is our hospitals. It's like they're in the movie The Hunger Games. They are, they're competing with other hospitals, with other states, with the federal government. We're getting calls from people. I know a guy who knows a guy in China. He has some PPE? Can we go after that? That is not the way this is supposed to work. And one of the things that has to happen as we're going through this, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to look at, what we could have done better. When we found out, when the administration was being told by the World Health Organization in January that this thing was serious and could turn into a major crisis, that was the time when a national inventory should have been taken in terms of what we have and what we don't. And whatever we didn't have, we should have invoked the Defense Production Act, or we should have found ways to build up that inventory. So we need to, again, if we find ourselves in this situation in the fall, let's learn from our mistakes leading up to this. And that's, everything is all interrelated here. If we don't get the health part of this right, then the business part of this stuff is not going to work. And if the hospitals don't have the equipment and don't have the money for infrastructure that they need, then that's a problem. So everybody here is all tied to the hip together. And so, we need to get the healthcare stuff right. And, and then we need to get the business stuff right. It all has to go together. So,
it's no time for to be managing in a just-in-time inventory method, no question. Question for you, before we go on to sort of the broader kind of easing of restrictions and long-term view. You mentioned some funding specifically for Worcester, and I think there might have been legislation that was specifically for cities over 50,000. But when you look at your whole district and all those municipalities, how much of the sort of supports are coming through Congress where you can apply that to someone like Worcester, and how much of that really sits over on the state side, where if we argue Massachusetts is going to come up 10% short on a $44 billion budget, right, $4 or $5 billion, how much are you just sort of generally block granting to states? Like, what's the view on those supports?
So in the CARES package, not the thing we're doing now, but the one before, I mean, there was money for some cities, like you mentioned, and Worcester got some of that money, and the city manager with the mayor were able to disperse it in ways that I think were very, very helpful. The governor also got a big chunk of money that he could distribute as he saw appropriate to cities and states. And there's, and some of the monies, we just announced that I think Worcester got, I may be wrong on that, like $5 million for our RTA, to deal with some of the transportation issues. I mean, so, there was money going right directly to the city, money going to the state. We need to expand that. I mean, again, because one of the things that I'm learning, and I think we all ought to appreciate, is that every community is different. And some communities have invested more in one area and not enough in another area, and vice versa. We need to allow local communities to be able to plug the holes, as is appropriate and where it makes sense in their community. So we need flexibility, and we need to give them the money, the money to help pay for our first responders, who are doing incredible work right now. So we did a little bit of that in the CARES Act. We need to do more of it. Again, we try to get it in this interim package. The Senate Majority Leaders did not want to do that. And so that will be left to hopefully the next package. But
But is there an acknowledgement that does need to be done by the Senate Majority Leader? I mean,
yeah, well, I mean, I have a tough time trying to figure out how he thinks and, where his priorities are. And I'll be honest, I mean, I don't think he shares my values on some of the stuff that needs to be done. But, my guess is that his membership in the Senate is hearing the same thing that I'm hearing from, my constituents and my local officials, and that is we need more local aid to deal with this. We need to be able to figure this out in a way that that we get the resources are going to where they need to go to. We in Washington we could say, oh, this is where the money should go, but when you get down locally, it may or may not be the best way to spend that money.
Right. So I want to we're going to eventually we've sort of penciled in till 10:45, and I've got a few specific questions I wanted to get to. But the broader question, it feels like, I know you said bailout. The other word that's been used is stimulus, and it's really more of a tourniquet on a wound.
That's a better word.
Yeah. And we're talking about another 400, 500 billion, and then you're referring to something else within the next 3 weeks. So when we look out longer, there are European countries who basically said, we're going to support 80% of payroll, 80% of the cost of payroll until this crisis abates, which is a massive commitment because that doesn't, that's not 8 weeks of funding, right? And you and I talked about also yesterday sort of the idea of an infrastructure bill, which is not just, the tourniquet part, but really making the money go towards goals and objectives that we have as a nation, which is to improve some of that infrastructure. And that's been sitting on the back burner for a few years now. It's a little hard right now. It feels every day is like a month. Right. And so when I ask you what the long-term view is, it's a little hard. But as you're having these discussions with your colleagues, what's the thinking? How do we move from the tourniquet stage into that next stage where we're investing in the right kind of growth, which is maybe the NIH, and what's in that mix as you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we ought to be, that is hopefully what this next round of deliberations in Congress is going to be about. And I'll just say by a little bit of an aside, it's one of the reasons why I'm trying tomorrow to tweak our House rules so that we can operate remotely, not just in terms of voting on the House floor, but in terms of doing committee hearings to help actually shape these next bills. Congress is a place that seems, mired in, the past in terms of the way we operate, tradition and history and procedures that have always been utilized. It took forever to get electronic voting in the House, but how we recover here requires serious deliberation. We should be having hearings right now. If we can't come together and do them, if people don't feel comfortable, we ought to be able to do them like this and start getting experts to come in and start saying, okay, this problem is worse than we thought, or this problem is handling itself. Here's where we need the investments, and we have to help try to shape that package. We'll see whether we get a majority of people to go along with me tomorrow. But I think we need that. I mean, we need to make intelligent, thoughtful decisions, and it not ought to be just a few people in the back room somewhere saying, how about this? How about that? We need to do oversight too to make sure that the money in the PPP is going to the kinds of businesses we all think they ought to be going to. So that's number one. But we're talking about investment, major transportation and infrastructure bill. Before this happened,
right.
I think we got like a D- rating in terms of where we were in our transportation and infrastructure in this country. We need to invest. We needed a long time ago to invest. We didn't do it. Maybe now is the opportunity to upgrade everything. Our public health system, working with our hospitals and our community health centers, say, okay, how can we be better prepared for this? What do you need in terms of infrastructure? That's a place we ought to invest. NSF, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. Again, they're not only about trying to solve problems like this, but it's also a stimulus creates jobs, creates opportunities, helps our economy. So we need to look at everything. And again, we're at a point where this really can't be a moment where we have these ideological discussions about, the role of government, about, the usual stuff. The bottom line is this is an emergency.
Yeah.
And if we want to throw up our hands and say, well, survival of the fittest, a lot of people are going to lose not only their jobs, a lot of businesses are going to go under. This economy will be ruined, and it'll be very difficult to recover.
Yeah.
We have to think big, and we have to think boldly, and we have to come together, and just move. I mean, we don't have time, to dither here. I mean, we don't have time to have, endless deliberation that goes on for months and months and months. The time for action is now. And I know you're probably getting calls. A lot of people who are watching are getting calls from people they know. People are panicked, they're nervous, they're concerned that there's not a light at the end of the tunnel. And we need to provide that light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, it's interesting when you study some of the countries and how quickly they recovered from the Great Recession of 2009, 2010, countries that invested more in keeping their folks employed,
Right.
And took on some of that debt at the time, had lower unemployment rates and had a faster recovery towards growth. So, the evidence is sort of in not the same crisis, but that investment done now clearly has some.
I think we all should be dedicated to trying to help keep people employed. I mean, nobody, that's one of the reasons why, we're supporting things like the PPP. How do we keep businesses viable? How do we keep employees, on the payroll? How do we ensure that there'll be a job when things get better? I mean, that's the goal here. But I think we have to understand that what we have done so far in and of itself is not enough. We have to look at a bigger picture, more holistically here. And again, I think that is what the next discussion is going to be about.
So Jim, a couple of quick questions that I want to kind of get in. We're at 10:42. Can we go to 10:50? Another 7 or 8 minutes? You're okay? You don't have a vote at 11?
My committee hearing is at 5. So
okay, all right, good. So
I have another conference call at 11. So
no problem. Well, we'll just go to 10:50 then. One question, and this was in the news. This is from an employer standpoint. The extra $600. This is the unemployment insurance extra incentive that got put on top of all the state plans,
right?
And it was, I think, a fixed $600 in addition to that. And from an employer standpoint, it made it a little backwards because one of the examples that got sent in, someone said someone making $20 an hour getting $800 a week can now get $1,000 on unemployment. Was that the intention to make that higher? And is there any there were certainly some senators that were trying to get a fix on that didn't happen last time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the intent, quite frankly, and again, this is what we all acted quickly, was simply to provide people with a little extra money to be able to get through this difficult time, not to try to get people to go on to unemployment if they didn't have to.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no fixes in this bill, again, we're going to have to, as we, one of the reasons why I want to have hearings back up and running is because I think we need to do a top to bottom review of how the CARES Act and the previous 2 bills that we passed, were implemented. Did they help? Did they go where they were supposed to go? Were there disincentives? Were there wrong incentives? What were they? Where were they? And how do we fix this going forward? Again, as I've been telling people, the way forward is not just, adding to the PPP, adding to the PPP, adding to the PP. We have to have, as you mentioned before, this broader discussion of, when we are able to safely resume business, what do we have to have in place to help those businesses not only survive, but thrive?
Right. So, there are questions about the PPP, and I just want to say it feels like they're in 2 buckets. One bucket is everyone who got the money or has been allocated, and its concerns about the specific nature of qualifying for forgiveness. And
Right.
that's fairly mechanical. And I think that's something that we will get into with Bob Nelson and Chris Swanson much more on Monday, sort of digging into those details for people who've got the money to make sure that they're really following the guidelines to maximize
Just so
that.
you know, we are talking to the Small Business Committee regularly.
Yeah.
I mean, and you know, we're passing on the concerns of our hospitality industry, our restaurants and others. And you know, so my guess is that at some point they're going to have to make some tweaks to this to basically accommodate what the reality is.
Right.
And so I hope that as we move forward, some of the concerns can be dealt with in future legislation.
Right, and so those may be rules changes, sort of a moving target for those who already got the funds. And then the second part of the folks are the people who are either stuck in line when the vault got shut, or need to get their loan processed, right? And that's sort of the second group. Beyond that, we're talking about infrastructure and other stuff. Is there any sense that there'll be a third bucket for PPP, or do you think this is really it for that specific program?
So I don't know the answer to
That's
that.
one of the questions.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, my own view is that we may need to do another infusion just because the demand is so great, just to kind of get us, you know, to a point where we're helping as many people as possible. But I don't know, to be honest with you. That's you know, we need to pass this. We need to pass this tomorrow in the House, so we can just unfreeze the money. And then starting immediately after that, we need to begin discussions about what the next package is going to look like and whether or not that includes an additional infusion of money for PPP. But I can't tell you definitively that there will be. I know people are like, well, we need to think differently. We need to think beyond this. But there may need to be another little bit of infusion here. But that's something that hasn't been decided yet. And again, it's not just what we think in the House, it's what the Senate thinks and what the President thinks.
Another question just came in related to supporting commercial mortgages. If a lot of companies stop, you know, they got their rent, I think, subsidized through the PPP, you can pay those 2 months of your rent in there. But if there's significant pressure on the commercial side, that leads to pressure on the banks. The question was, can the Federal Reserve move in and create some supports for the commercial mortgage market?
I would think they could, and I hope that they, you know, I mean, and we've been talking to them about that. So I can't tell you what they're going to do, but I mean, yeah, they could.
Okay. And one question came in, and you see these two, related to Mitch McConnell's test and the president's test. And I know you, did you think, are those tests politically motivated? What is the filter for that? Like, for instance, not including hospitals and not wanting to include hospitals in this round. Was it next? How are we reading the tea leaves for each of those other groups that have to say yes?
Yeah. So look, I mean, McConnell wanted this to be just an extension of PPP, period, nothing else. I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't think that, you know, I think he's trying to avoid, you know, bigger packages in the future, but there's no way around that. I mean, that's just the reality. What I'm worried about right now is we're going through this phase where, rather than dealing with reality, which is that this is a serious pandemic that is deadly. I mean, that we're now and we're going back to the stage of, well, we could just weather it out. Everybody go back to work, and we'll just deal with it. And that's what's really, really dangerous. It's creating. I hear it among some of my colleagues in the House. Well, we don't need it. People just go back to business. We don't need any more tourniquets. We don't need any more investments. Just go back to business as usual. And I think that's playing a role in kind of what we do next and what we don't do next. And I'm really, really worried about that because, again, I think if we go back to business as usual too soon, we're going to end up in a worse situation. We may have to start this all over again. With the president, I can't tell you how he thinks, because one day he says one thing, the next day he says something else. I mean,
Sometimes on the same day.
right. My own personal belief, is that, we should stop airing these press conferences, because it doesn't seem to me to be responsible journalism to allow disinformation to be sent out there on a daily basis, because that's what much of it is. I mean, I want to hear what the doctors and experts and economists have to say, but I don't need to have the president tell me that he thinks that this malaria drug is the be all end all, because now we're finding out it isn't. So look, we are working with them. I mean, and we're going to continue to have these conversations.
Is Mnuchin as pragmatic as he appears to be?
So Mnuchin has been the one guy in the administration that we can actually make a deal with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's been kind of the go-between, and he has, been willing to deal and willing to work, and has been receptive to some of the concerns that have been expressed. So, I mean, I don't agree with him on everything. Having said that, I mean, we're able to do business with him, and I think that's important right now.
Yeah, got it. Hey, well, Jim, we've hit our 10:51 here, and we really appreciate you coming on and talking to folks about this funding, about how things are going in Congress, and we wish you and your family well, and thank your team, who I'm sure are working 8 days a week these days with all the constituent concerns you're facing.
Well, I appreciate it. Again, I mean, if people have individual questions, give my office a call, and we will follow up. And if you're having trouble with the SBA, or trouble with this, or trouble with that, call us, and we will follow up. And again, on my webpage, mcgovern.house.gov, we will, when this bill passes tomorrow, post the latest details so everybody has access to it. But we want to make sure that we're there to be helpful. And so I wish everybody the best. Thank you, Peter, and I hope everybody stays safe.
Appreciate it. And I just want to say, it's next, if folks can watch their email, we're going to have that session on the minutia, that little details of the PPP next Monday, which I think will be helpful. And I want to thank again Webster 5 and Fallon Health for being presenting sponsors and help making this series happen. We're all trying to help our communities, through this tough time. And appreciate your time again, Jim. And good luck on that vote tomorrow.
All right.